The following video may include mature situations, stories of the paranormal, the occult, or what some may consider disturbing or offensive. Viewer discretion is advised. Have you ever felt a cold draft in an empty room? Heard whispers when no one else was there? Or maybe you have seen shadows that move on their own? These are just a few of many encounters that people have with the unexplained. Today, I'm sharing your stories. I'm going to share with you several spooky, possibly scary, definitely paranormal stories that you've sent me. Here we go. So I'm starting with subscriber number 1, and I'm just labeling it just to keep track of what I'm telling you. But I am going to read directly from their email messages. And I just want to preface this by saying I will not be using names for privacy reasons. Okay. Good evening. I found your story time and would like to add one of my own. I don't find it peculiar or weird or disturbing to share these types of stories. My mother passed when I was 25. She didn't raise me, but I knew of her, and I would visit her during summers spent with my grandparents in another state. She often told me that she loved me, but we never had a mother-daughter relationship. Fast forward many years later, I often felt spirits, if you will, around me, and haven't ever questioned it. So one night, I have a dream of my maternal grandmother, my mother's mother, and my great-grandmother, my grandmother's mother-in-law, and myself, and we're all standing before my mother, who is on a small raised platform, and is absolutely beautiful again. She passed from cancer. She looked like a 1940s movie star with a long pink satin dressing gown, her hair done up, and she was sitting at a table painting her nails. There was a room full of people over to the side of the dream that knew me, and they all wanted to come and talk to me, but were sort of held back. My grandmother says to my mother, "You aren't going to tell her?" My great-grandmother says nothing, and my mother continues to paint her nails and says, "She'll be all right," meaning me. End of dream. And I don't think any more of it. A couple of months later, I am waiting for a city bus to take me to work. The weather had been cool, but this particular day the sun was out. I was sitting on a bench talking with the usual crowd that gathered in the mornings, and all of a sudden, I heard a girl next to me scream. I turned to look, but all I saw was a flash of white, and I heard a loud crash. When I woke up, I was half off the bench that I was sitting on. I just let myself go. I looked up at the sky, and I thought, well, I didn't die. I don't remember a lot of what happened after. I was in a coma for 3 days, and then sent to rehab for a brain injury. I had to relearn walking, riding, bathing, everything. I found out later that white blur that went by was a kid driving a truck and texting. He jumped the curb, hit me and 2 other people, and ran into a utility pole that broke in half that came down on my legs. 5 years later, I am still dealing with the effects of it all, but Mother was right. I am okay, and I know she was watching over me. Thank you for letting me share this. It is a testament that when you feel alone, all you have to do is listen and find out that you're not. So many thanks for sending in that story and sharing it with us. And it definitely has a very paranormal, spiritual aspect to it. And the further along I get into these stories, I am going to touch on just the differences of certain encounters, just a surface level, because sometimes things are spiritual and it comes from a good place, but sometimes it can be sinister. And that will lead us into our second story. This story goes back to the early 1980s. It was roughly around 1982, and I was about 14 years old. I was at home alone while my parents were out for the evening with friends. We lived in a normal neighborhood that was probably about 30 years old. We were the second owners of the home. It had been built in the mid-1960s. Our garage had been converted into a living room. That's where our TV was, as well as sofas and such. I never remember having any other experiences while living there. The evening started out very normal. I was old enough for my parents to leave me alone for the evening by myself, so this was something very normal for me. I was in our living room watching TV. Nothing special from what I remember. And it was around 10 or 11 p.m. at night. And as I mentioned earlier, my parents were out for the evening with friends. Our house had hardwood floors, which made very distinct sounds when either walking on the floors or opening and closing the doors. I was laying on the couch watching TV when I heard the distinct sound of shoes walking on the floor in the front of the house. And then I heard a door slide open and close, and then the continued sound of footsteps. I got up from the couch, walked through our kitchen to the front of the house where I heard the noise to check and make sure my parents were home. Nobody was there. I looked out the front window to our driveway, and my parents' car was not in the driveway. In fact, there were no other cars in the driveway. I opened the hall door, walked around to look, but no one was home. I thought, that's odd, so I went back into the living room where I was and continued to watch TV. About 30 minutes later, I heard a newborn baby crying. We didn't have any babies in the house. Again, I was alone. After the sound of the crying, I again heard footsteps walking on the floor. The sliding door opened again, and the footsteps continued. After that point, I knew that I heard those sounds. So I got up again to check on what I heard. Just like before, my parents were not home, but I know what I heard. I continued in the hallway where the sound had come from, checked each of the 3 bedrooms, and again verified that no one was there. I walked back to the living room where I was watching TV for maybe another 30 minutes, and finally, around midnight, my parents returned home. Nothing strange from there. I didn't tell my parents about what I heard. I just figured I must have been hearing things. A few weeks later, I overhear my mother talking with her friend about how she had been hearing a newborn baby crying in one of the bedrooms in the evening. She never mentioned footsteps, just the sound of a crying baby. Her friend said that she probably just heard a cat outside because sometimes they sound like a baby. And I have heard of that before. But they go on to say, I don't think those 2 sounds are similar. Several years later, I was away at college, and my parents sold that house to one of the neighbors who bought it for one of their children who had recently gotten married. My father got a phone call from our old neighbor who purchased the house and basically chewed him out. And he told my father that my father had supposedly sold him a haunted house. My father, who didn't believe in paranormal stuff, thought the neighbor was crazy, but the neighbor relayed a story that their son and daughter-in-law told them about an incident that happened when they had friends over for a weekend. They mentioned that they experienced strange paranormal occurrences, one of which was a bite that one of their guests received from an invisible being, and that frequently when they would go into their kitchen, all the drawers and cabinet doors would be opened seconds after they had walked out of a normal kitchen. My father told the neighbor that they were crazy, and we had never experienced anything like that. My father ended up calling another old neighbor from our previous home who had lived in the neighborhood since it was originally built in the 1960s. He and his wife were an elderly couple at this point, and my father asked him about the occurrences that the buyer's son and family had experienced. The elderly old next-door neighbor had mentioned that the original owners of the house were a young couple who lived in the house that had an infant child that had passed away in that house in its sleep. I had come home for a holiday or something, and my parents were talking about what has been happening in our old house and the discussion they had with the people that bought the house. That's when I told them about what I had heard one night many years prior. My mother had mentioned that she had heard similar infant crying in the past, but no one had ever said anything to each other. None of us ever experienced the crazy things such as opened cabinet doors or bites or any other strange activities. We never saw any spirits or ghosts or anything like that. We just heard things from time to time. We never followed up with that family that bought the house to see if the occurrence has continued. We do know that they did have a priest go over to the house and bless it. And that is the end of the story. And honestly, it kind of reminds me of something something similar that happened to myself. So while I was in high school, when I was younger, I lived with my grandparents. And the home that they purchased, I believe, was built like in the 1920s. Some nights, the room that I slept in would get extremely cold, and there were times where I would just be frozen in fear. As I got older, I didn't tell anyone, by the way, when those things were happening, and it happened several times. At one point, I almost felt like someone was literally standing over me, but every time I would be like mid-sleep or dozing off and the room would go cold, I just could sense something in the room. So I immediately shut my eyes and I would say a prayer because that's all I knew how to do. At the time, I didn't think, is it a ghost? Even though I did feel this, it's just, who's going to believe you? I felt ridiculous. So I did this several times when I stayed in this particular room in my grandmother's house. So later, I was still kind of thinking about these things that happened to me when I lived in my grandmother's house. And I remember I read an article about sleep paralysis. So I chalked it up to sleep paralysis because it's sort of the way sleep paralysis is described. It was very similar to my experiences that I had. So I left it at that. Well, recently, I was chatting with my aunt who also lived at the house at the time I was there. And she went on to say that she actually felt the same thing in her bedroom, which is a completely separate part of the house, and that she would see shadows walking through my grandmother's home. And both of us experienced this, and we never told each other until just recently. Just last year, my grandmother said that she claimed that she saw someone standing at her bedroom door, but my grandmother is elderly, so she just thought, oh, is it my time? She thought it's my time. But we kind of think that there are some spooky things going on at her house. Now, do I want to go there and find out? No, I do not. But there's that. So this story kind of reminds me of something that sort of happened to me, where you live in a household, you experience different paranormal things, and you don't realize it till later when you actually divulge the stories. So on to subscriber story number 3. And this subscriber we are going to call M. The letter M. Hello, I am a pagan and a santero. I wrote for my blog Adventures of a Mage in Miami. You can call me M for short. I used to work in paranormal groups. I saw and witnessed a lot of strange things in my life. What I am about to tell you is one of the worst. I worked for an exorcist. I am a demonologist, and I used to make protection charms for people. A lot of paranormal investigators do dangerous things or go to dangerous places, and the idea of using amulets or holy items to keep safe hasn't entered their minds. So I was, for the longest time, their go-to person. I was going to give you a list of experiences, but this particular experience still messes with my head, and it tortured me inside to even think about it. It's a story that I swore that I would tell someone someday, and today I decided that it would be you. I think it was your hospital story that convinced me to do this, the one about the only time you had seen a ghost. This event kind of messes with me to this day. I had known this man for years. He lived with his elderly mom. He was one of my good friends. We used to ride up and down Miami all the time and have adventures. He was way older than me, but he was good people. His mother stayed home and took care of his pets, which he called his children. I do too. But one day, for some weird reason, I hadn't seen him. This was strange, because I used to see him multiple times a day. So the days turn into weeks, and soon almost a month has passed by. I get concerned. Then one day I see him again. But something was off with him. His whole mood and demeanor were down, and he told me that his mother had passed away a month before. She unfortunately had a severe heart attack, and the hospital couldn't save her. I should stop here and tell you that when people feed me information, I get visions sometimes. Or I can sense things and tell you what is going to happen, or what could have been. So when he told me that, I got this nasty psychic flash in my head. Well, more than a flash. It was like I was in this other place, a place that was cold, covered in shadows. It sort of looked like a hospital. I saw her outside of the hospital where she passed in a nightgown, and she was shivering in the cold and crying, asking in Spanish where she was, looking for someone, anyone to help her. But if anyone was there, I couldn't see them. It was like a void in there with no one else present. She was all alone there. What I have come to learn is this. Some people, when they die, they create their own mini dimension, like a time-space bubble. I call it a death dream. But some dreams are nightmares. I nearly cried. This was the first time I had seen a freshly dead soul before. I have seen souls in purgatory or limbo, but they were always there for a few years, and they more or less adapt. This poor woman was so powerless and frail. After the meeting with my friend and learning of his mother's passing, I went to one of my altars in my house. I prayed to Lord Krishna. He's one of my go-to gods. I begged him to help her. I felt him around me, a warm, loving energy, like an electric blanket around me. And I saw the woman enveloped by an aquamarine-colored light, and she was gone. I felt her presence leave that place. About a week later, I saw my friend again, only this time, he was happy. He had a spring in his step. He told me one of his cousins dreamed of his mother. Only she looked young and beautiful the way she did before. And in this dream, she told him not to worry, that she was fine. He described her as dressed in light, if light could be worn like clothing. I already knew that she was fine because Lord Krishna in his mercy sent me a sign. But it still messes with my head for two reasons. One, I still remember that cold, empty place. I felt the powerlessness. I felt her cold. I felt her sadness. And it was an emptiness that I cannot describe. And my one contact with that place made me feel like my psychic nerves were flayed. But that's not the worst feeling. I started to think about what would have happened had I not been around to cross her over. Since then, I have become paranoid and overprotective of people in my community. When I hear of a death, I instantly rush to cross someone over. I learn protocols and prayers now to better help the dead. I look at my own mother's face, and I remember that poor woman and how oblivious this man was to his mother's fate. And it turns out he hadn't bothered to perform the proper funeral rites and rituals, hadn't asked the priest for a blessing or a funeral mass, nothing. If I hadn't come along to help her, she may have stayed there forever. It wasn't hell, but it's hard to know which is worse, limbo or the pit. But needless to say, I have a fear of people I love being trapped in some dark place. I have developed special techniques for crossing over the dead, and I even give mass offerings for all the dead, even strangers, at cemeteries. With kindest regards, M. M, thank you for sharing your story. It's very fascinating, and absolutely I can see if you felt that sense of emptiness that this lost soul felt, I definitely think it almost stays with you forever because it's a feeling that you've never felt, and it probably was very traumatic. So thank you for sharing your story, and I hope that you are doing well. And for those of you curious, M did have a blog. I'm not sure if it's current. You can Google Adventures of a Mage in Miami. I kind of looked up the term lost souls, and it pretty much explains itself in the actual term, but I just wanted to read something to you. So a lost soul is a term used in various spiritual and religious traditions to describe a person who is spiritually disconnected or trapped. It often implies a state of suffering, confusion, or negative karma. Different interpretations of the concept exist. Religious beliefs, for example. In many religious traditions, a lost soul might refer to a person who has committed sins or transgressions and is unable to find salvation or spiritual enlightenment. And I always like to just remind my viewers that I like to keep what I talk about sort of free of judgment, because what I believe or what you believe might not be what someone else believes. And we should be understanding, because like I always say, we are humans and we only know a fraction of what there is to know on Earth, and much less the universe. So just keep that in mind. Just because you wholeheartedly believe in this one thing, it doesn't just make it the, end all be all thing to believe. We all believe things differently, and we all experience things differently, like paranormal entities or occurrences. And this is another thing that I think is important to consider. So this is something else I looked up, and it's the difference between a ghost and a demon. And the reason why I say this, because like I said earlier, sometimes paranormal experiences or occurrences can be something that kind of brings us closure and peace, and it doesn't feel negative. But there are also spirits or entities that are very sinister and very malicious. And I think it's very important that I kind of bring this up because, again, I found myself in a situation where I had a subscriber. I shared her story. I will link the link to that video below. And she has been dealing with a situation, a paranormal situation, for over 10 years. And so I know I share these stories, but these are real stories from real people and true events. And I always say, whether you believe it or not is up to you, but it doesn't make it any less true just because you personally do not experience it. So, the difference between ghosts and demons. Ghosts. The nature of ghosts usually considered the spirits of deceased humans who remain attached to the earthly plane. Their intent, typically, often harmless or even benevolent, simply lingering due to unfinished business or strong emotional ties. Interactions. Interactions with ghosts may manifest as apparitions, cold spots, unexplained noises, or a general sense of unease. Influence. Typically limited to influencing the emotional or psychological state of living beings. And in another video that I posted, I sort of explained residual hauntings. And for those of you that don't know what residual hauntings, the best way to describe it is, for example, you see stories or you see video footage or evidence of people that go to these like Civil War sites and they still see soldiers marching or like cannons being shot. Clearly, it's haunted, but from what I researched, it was such a tragic, just brutal war that the energy that the deceased left there on that land, it's just the energy that just kind of plays in a loop. It just plays in a loop, which is if you go to like haunted houses or haunted libraries, people have stories that, oh, the old, groundskeeper is haunting people, but the groundskeeper isn't chasing people. By the way, that's my cat. The groundskeeper spirit is not chasing people. The groundskeeper spirit is literally just playing in a loop, doing what they did when they were alive. And it's just, they probably stayed in that library, lived in the library, or worked in that library for such a long time that that energy just imprinted itself in that place. Now, we're going to talk about demons. And this is just, I know that freaks people out. It freaks me out, actually. The nature, evil or malevolent entities that derive power from negative emotions and actions. Intent, to cause harm, temptation, or destruction. Interactions. Interactions may possess individuals, cause physical manifestations, or influence the environment. Influence. The influence can have a more direct and powerful impact on the physical world and the lives of humans. For example, poltergeist, or, in the story where the house that the father sold to the neighbor, one of the party guests had scratches and bites on them. That's not something that's benevolent. That definitely is like ill intent and just evil. And these are things that you have to maybe be hyper vigilant if you do find yourself in a home that you suspect is just creepy, scary, and haunted. For example, my grandmother's house. None of us have really experienced anything that I would say was evil or just sinister. But I'll tell you what, when I was asleep and I was just paralyzed with fear, I didn't feel like something was going to attack me. I knew something was there that that wasn't supposed to be. And I want to say, when it comes to my grandmother's house, we did recently find out that the previous owners, both the husband and the wife, were elderly people, and they both passed away in the home. But I think it is the elderly man that kind of stayed there. The only thing that we did, because I did mention that one of my subscribers, in the story I just told you where some souls are just lost, we did say a prayer for him. We just tried to sort of pray and not really communicate with the spirit, but no one in the house has had like any major experiences since then, but only time will tell. And it does make me sad learning that, you know, there could be a lost soul in my grandmother's house. So we do the best that we can. She did have a priest come over to her house and just kind of say prayers and things like that. And we hope that helps. So I'm going to share one last story with you. So John is dancing at a backyard party. The mood is very festive and lively. Suddenly, it starts to rain, and the party guests run for cover. John decides it's time to go home. He says goodbye to his friends and leaves. On his drive home, he sees a young woman in a yellow dress walking. Since it's raining, he slows down and asks if she needs a ride home. She stops and turns around. John is instantly captivated by her beauty. She smiles and walks over to the passenger side to get in. As John drives away, he asks her where she was headed. She replies she was on her way home. He asks where she lives. She explains on Rose Valley Drive. John points out that she is on Evergreen Road. He notices she is shivering and soaked from the rain, so he reaches in his back seat and offers her his jacket. She thanks him and puts it on. He introduces himself as John. She replies that her name is Laura. On the drive home, they chat and talk about anything and everything. The more they talk, the more enamored John becomes. They both laugh and enjoy the robust conversation. As he arrives to her humble home, he parks. They both continue chatting for a bit, and John clearly doesn't want the night to end. But it is late. John and Laura stare at each other for a moment. Then she smiles and says goodnight. As she walks past the front of the car and reaches the front porch steps, she waves goodbye. John waves and drives off. As he's driving away, he realizes he forgot to get his jacket. He decides this presents the perfect opportunity for him to return tomorrow and ask her on a date. After work, John decides to head over to Laura's house. He arrives and walks up the porch steps and knocks on the door. He quickly checks his outfit, smooths over his hair. As he clears his throat, the door opens. A middle-aged woman answers the door. She greets him with a smile and asks what he needs. He assumes this is Laura's mother. He nervously introduces himself and explains that he was the one that brought her home last night. He goes on to ask if it's okay for her to come to the door so they can have a little chat. Then John notices the friendly woman's face has turned serious. He thinks maybe he made a mistake, as this may be too forward of him. He technically is a stranger. John continues and includes the fact that he lent Laura his jacket. She asks John to hold a minute, and she goes back inside. So John is nervously waiting, as he did not expect things to be kind of awkward with Laura's mom. The middle-aged woman returns holding a framed picture. John instantly recognizes Laura in the photo. Then, out of nowhere, the woman starts to berate him for playing such a cruel prank on her. John is baffled, and he goes over his story again and includes the fact that he did lend Laura his jacket. He also explains that he dropped her off and she stood on the very porch they were standing on and waved goodbye, and everything was fine. The woman goes on to tell John that Laura is her daughter that passed away 10 years ago. John is just floored. He is completely stunned and shocked at hearing this. After taking a moment to process this information, John asks if she could tell him how Laura passed away. She says that 10 years ago, Laura was on a date. She and her boyfriend were in a terrible accident over on Evergreen Road. Laura passed away instantly on impact. Listening to the story, John realizes that Evergreen Road is exactly where he encountered Laura the night before. Suddenly, he feels a bittersweet sadness. How could he deny that what he witnessed was Laura's ghost? After asking Laura's mom for information on Laura's final resting place, John apologizes again and he leaves. He arrives at the cemetery Laura is buried at. He parks his car and walks to the spot that Laura's mother told him where her daughter would be. As he walks closer to the grave, he stops dead in his tracks, and his face goes pale. He sees her engraved name on the headstone, and hanging off of the headstone is his jacket. Now, when I first heard that story, it gave me chills, and I wanted to share it with you because it is an old urban legend, and the way I heard it was in Spanish. I don't know if you've heard this story before. I believe it's called La Mujer y la Chaqueta. It's like the woman and the jacket. It might have different titles, but it is shared all the time for a long time, and I believe it was like a Latino or a Mexican urban legend, but then you don't have to be from like Mexico to share the story. I'm sure plenty of people have heard it. Just my family from Mexico, has shared the story. And I just thought it was such a creepy, spooky story. So that's why I wanted to share it with you. But it does give an example of Laura passing away in the wreckage, and maybe her soul is lost in the place that she passed away because it was so sudden. So when she's in a different plane of existence, she doesn't realize she's passed on. And maybe the whole, again, kind of like repeating what probably would have gone on the night that she died on her date. Maybe that's what her soul is seeking, and she can't find that closure. So that story does give me chills, but it is sad because with the information that I'm learning with our subscriber telling the story of his experience with lost souls, it really does make you sad. It's very spooky that, someone could be left in limbo or just in a place that's just filled with emptiness and just solitude and being alone and just shocked and not realizing that you've passed on. So I hope you all learned something, and at the very least, I hope you enjoyed the stories because in my opinion, they are very spooky and creepy. And I want to give a shout out and a thank you to all my subscribers that sent in those stories. So I will see you in the next video. Bye.